Today I'm going to talk about shading. I will cover the basics of shading and I will show you the technique I use to shade faces from different angles. By the end of this video, even if you are an absolute beginner, you will understand some basic terminology and how light and shadows make a flat drawing look more 3D. I will try my best to simplify as much as possible. However, to better understand what this tutorial is all about, you should know how to draw a face in the first place. Otherwise, you will just feel lost as I enter into more advanced territory. Check out my previous videos if you don't know the basics of portrait drawing. I talked about the Loomis method, which is a great technique in learning how to draw a face from any angle. I will probably make another tutorial, this time going deeper into the topic. Before we get started, I would appreciate you leaving a like to show some support because I spent a lot of time trying to make this video. Thank you so much. A disclaimer, I don't consider myself a professional artist. I'm just a random guy trying to share my own experience and adding values to the community. But from what I have learned from different sources so far, the knowledge that I'm about to share with you is pretty accurate and has been very useful to me up until now. I will stick with it until proven otherwise. Now let's jump right into it. It's important to know that there is no way you can learn how to shade properly without using a reference photo. That's why I will use some for this video to make it easier to understand. I like to use the hassaneart. You can buy the physical one or just download the images from Pinterest. These 3D models are very important when it comes to understanding the light and shadows and how they interact with one another. You can also find free websites that have 3D models like this one. To understand the basics of shading, it's important to know the basic structure of 3D forms. The planes make basic shape look 3D. Let's take this circle for instance. To make this shape look 3D on paper, you must add planes. Now that we add planes, this circle has now become a sphere. Now to make it realistic, we need values. This is where the light and shadows come into action. Knowing where the light is coming from is super important. So let's say the light source is, in this example, from the top. Therefore, the planes that face the light get brighter and the planes that turn away from the light get darker. When we simplify this, we will be left with only two values. One value for the light family and one dark value for the shadow family. Let's apply this to a human face in front of you. I'm using this 3D model for illustration. In this example, you see the light hitting the top and progressively gets less bright as the planes turn away from the light. From the brow ridge down to the neck, the whole face is in the shadows. Of course, except the nose, which comes forward and of which top plane is facing the light source. In fact, the light hits certain areas of the face depending on the spotlight and environmental lighting. For example, if we bring this light source a little bit to the top front, you notice how it progressively affects certain areas of the face, like the cheeks in particular. In this case scenario, however, a couple of features like the brow ridge, nose, and cheekbones will be casting a shadow into the bottom sides and corners. That's called a cast or drop shadow. At this point, if you learn this, it's enough to get you started. Now things will get a little bit complicated. I will try my best to make it as simple as possible. You see, before the light turns into complete shadow, it gets through a transition. That transition is called the midtone. It is a separation between light and dark. Parts of these midtones will be brighter and darker depending on the light source, planes, the roundness and softness of the face. The more subtle the surface of an area such as here is, the softer the transition will be. And the sudden the change in the plane's direction, the sharper the transition from the light to shadow will be. I know there is so much information, so let's take one step at a time. So let's use this example. Here is a sketch I made to illustrate the shading. We are going to use a simpler example on the side and use the same approach to shade this drawing. So let's take this sphere and the cube. Remember, the human head is composed of these primary shapes. It's easier to draw more complex 3D objects like heads when you understand the basic 3D forms and how they interact with the light. Anyway, let's come back to the drawing. So, in this example, the light comes from the top left, which means the planes that directly face the light are brighter than those turning away from it. However, These objects have different surface. One is round and subtle, whereas the other is flat and sudden. Nevertheless, both forms have planes and the approach to shade them is similar. So, after the line sketch and shadow mapping, I like to separate the light and shadows with the core shadow. It's the edge where these two forms transition from light to dark, and where the planes start to turn away from the light. When you draw a portrait, pay close attention to the thickness and softness of the core shadow. I like to start with the shadow first. From the core shadow, you can group the shadows into one dark value to create a contrast between light and dark. When I shade, I like to use a cross-hatching technique. However, shading towards the direction of the light or shadow is more effective. Now there are different shadows within the shadow family. This shadow is called a drop shadow or a cat shadow. It occurs when an object blocks the light from hitting another object or form. The occlusion shadow is the darkest of them all. It appears when two objects meet in the shadow and get darker as the area of connection gets deeper. This is a reflective light. It's also called bounce light, as it bounces from one object to another. In this example, the light bounces from the cube onto the bottom of the sphere, and here it bounces from the table onto the cube. But look how different the intensity of these two reflective light is. The reason is because the surface of the cube that reflects the light is white, therefore reflecting a brighter light, and the surface of the table is dark and relatively creating a darker reflection. The intensity of the reflective light also depends on the proximity of the object that reflects the light and the angle of the light source. Now let's move to the light family. After the core shadow, the halftones or midtones begin. They will get brighter as they get closer to the light source, and darker as they turn away from it. Sometimes I like to start shading with midtones as they are closest to the skin tone. As I mentioned before, the halftones are the transition between light and shadow. The more subtle the planes of the forms are, like in here, the more gradation on the halftone. And the more dramatic the change in planes of the form is, the lesser halftone values you will need to use. I don't know if that makes any sense. And for the blending, I will talk about it later on. Now the light of the plane that directly faces the light is called the center light. However, it's different from the highlight, which is the brightest of them all. Highlights are located at the point of an object where it is closest to the light source. Let's try to apply what we have learned so far to this line drawing. I used a reference photo to draw this portrait. It was a quick sketch, so there might be some minor mistakes. The aim was not to copy the reference photo 100%. Anyway, I used the Loomis method to draw the proportion. Before I start shading, I like to map out my shadows so it gets easier for me to shade. Because the light is coming from the top left, the measure planes on the right side will be in the dark. I like to start with one big shadow to create contrast. I then add the cat's shadow under the nose, eye socket, lips, and hair. The head casts a large shadow on the shoulder. The cat's shadow is darker inside those remote corners. You can use whatever pencil you want for the shading as long as you have a good pressure control. If that's not the case, go and practice to improve your pressure control and line drawing. I like to go as light as possible and slowly build darker values as I get more comfortable with the overall feeling of the drawing. We can see the reflective light around the cheeks, but it isn't bright enough because it doesn't directly bounce from a dark object. Now, after I put down the shadows, it's time to add some halftones. In this example, the halftones are located in these areas, so make sure the core shadow isn't consistent as I mentioned earlier. It may vary depending on the forms. The core shadow on the nose is thinner and sharper than the one on the cheekbone, which is softer and wider. Observe how I add more details on the face, especially in the eyes. I want to bring the viewer's focus on a specific area. The eyes are generally the most important features in drawing as they reveal the personality of the subject that we are drawing. Some of the details that I add include the occlusion shadow. It's usually located under the eyelid, tear duct, where the lips touch, and under the wings of the nose. As you may have noticed, for those who have been watching me draw, that I like to draw the hair later on, and I also tend to make them less detailed. I don't have a logical explanation for that, except that it is part of my style. Nevertheless, the hair also has forms, therefore can be shaded the same way. However, try to follow the rhythm and direction of the hair, and try not to draw individual hair. Also, the hair is darker compared to the skin tone. I will probably make a separate video on this particular topic. Now, after I identified and placed the shadows on halftones, I go back and add another layer of darker values to match the shading on the reference. I also use my finger to blend in those areas where there is a soft transition. Remember, you don't need many blending tools to make your drawing look realistic. Now at this stage, the drawing is almost done. The only thing remaining is the highlights. The most obvious ones are on the bow of the nose, the bridge of the nose. There are also other highlights on the bottom lip, on the cheekbone, and of course on the hair. You don't necessarily have to draw every single highlight. Highlights are details, use them to your own advantage. For instance, you can use them to draw the viewer's attention to the eyes. Now once you are comfortable with your overall shading, you are free to add as many darker layers as you want to create more realistic effect. This stage is just about details and refining your drawing. The more details you add, the longer your drawing is going to take. And remember, not every detail makes a drawing look good. Great artists use fewer details and still make their own drawing look amazing. They have learned the rules and were able to break them by becoming more creative. And that's it for today. Now there is a lot more to cover about shading faces, and if you want me to make a follow-along video about this topic, let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next video.